Washington, D.C., September 29, 2025. With less than 36 hours before a potential government shutdown, US Vice President JD Vance issued a stark warning on Sunday, blaming congressional Democrats for the looming crisis and urging them to end what he described as unreasonable demands, holding up a short-term funding bill. Speaking to reporters outside the White House after a high-stakes meeting between President Donald Trump and congressional leaders, Vance painted a picture of a government on the brink of paralysis and placed responsibility squarely on Democratic leaders. JD Vance said, "First of all, we have to keep essential services functioning as well as possible if the Democrats shut down the government, and Russell Vought has been tasked with making sure that's possible." The Vice President was referring to Russell Vought, the former director of the Office of Management and Budget, who has been tasked with coordinating contingency measures should the shutdown take effect. Vance stressed that even as the administration prepared for a shutdown, the focus remained on shielding ordinary Americans from the worst disruptions. JD Vance said, "Now you asked about negotiations. One of the things I admired about the president, but frankly, the entire team's approach during the conversation we just had with Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries was, they have some crazy ideas. Giving taxpayer money to illegal aliens for healthcare, that's a crazy idea. Funding transgender surgeries in Peru, that's a crazy idea. But they had some ideas that I actually thought were reasonable, and they had some ideas that the president thought was reasonable. What's not reasonable is to hold those ideas as leverage and to shut down the government unless we give you everything you want." The vice president's remarks signaled that while there was room for bipartisan compromise, he believed Democrats were demanding too many concessions in exchange for their votes to keep the government funded. Vance repeatedly underscored that differences over policy should not be used as bargaining chips to halt the functioning of government. JD Vance said, "We have disagreements about tax policy, but you don't shut the government down. We have disagreements about healthcare policy, but you don't shut the government down. You don't use your policy disagreements as leverage to not pay our troops, to not have essential services of government actually function. You don't say the fact that you disagree about a particular tax provision is an excuse for shutting down the people's government and all the essential services that come along with it." His words captured the administration's frustration at the standoff that has brought Congress to the brink of a funding lapse, with vital federal agencies and military paychecks at stake. The vice president urged Democrats to return to the negotiating table in good faith and to pass a stopgap bill that would keep the government open while talks continued. JD Vance said, "Let's work on it together, but let's do it in the context of an open government that's providing essential services to the American people. That's all that we're proposing to do, and the fact that they refuse to do that shows how unreasonable their position is. I think we're headed to a shutdown because the Democrats won't do the right thing." Vance's comments came after a tense meeting in the White House that brought together President Trump, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Democratic Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and top Republican negotiators. Despite hours of discussion, no breakthrough emerged, leaving the government on a collision course with a shutdown at midnight Monday. If no agreement is reached, hundreds of thousands of federal employees could be furloughed, military personnel might go unpaid, and essential government programs, from air traffic control to national parks, could face disruptions. The administration has already tasked Vought and senior budget officials with prioritizing which operations must continue to safeguard national security and public safety. Vance emphasized that the administration's priority was to minimize harm to the public, but warned that some services would inevitably be curtailed. JD Vance said earlier, "We have to keep essential services functioning as well as possible if the Democrats shut down the government." At the heart of the standoff are disagreements over spending levels and policy riders attached to the short-term funding measure. Democrats have reportedly pushed for funding expansions that Republicans have rejected, including healthcare support for undocumented immigrants and overseas programs criticized by conservatives. While Vance acknowledged there were reasonable ideas worth discussing, he said Democrats had linked them to unrelated demands in ways that threatened to derail urgent efforts to keep the government open. The White House meeting was described by sources as both frank and contentious. Schumer and Jeffries argued that Republican-backed spending caps would hurt domestic priorities and social services, while GOP negotiators insisted that Democrats were trying to force policy changes through brinkmanship. Vance's remarks appeared to be part of a broader effort by the administration to frame the crisis as a product of Democratic intransigence by highlighting specific policy disputes, such as healthcare funding for undocumented immigrants and funding transgender surgeries in Peru. Vance aimed to rally public opinion against what he called unreasonable demands. The vice president's sharp criticism of those proposals reflected the administration's strategy of portraying the Democrats' stance as ideologically extreme and disconnected from the urgent need to keep government functioning. With the clock ticking toward a shutdown, pressure is mounting on both parties to find a compromise. The Senate and House remain divided not only on spending priorities, but also on the length of the temporary funding extension. The administration has urged lawmakers to pass a clean, short-term continuing resolution to keep the government funded while talks proceed on a longer-term budget package. However, without bipartisan support, such a measure is unlikely to advance in both chambers. Analysts say the standoff carries risks for both parties. A prolonged shutdown could anger voters and disrupt economic recovery, potentially reshaping the political landscape ahead of next year's elections. For President Trump and Vice President Vance, the challenge lies in demonstrating that they sought compromise and acted in the national interest. For Democrats, the risk is being seen as obstructing government operations over policy disputes. The looming shutdown underscores the ongoing dysfunction in Washington and the challenges of governing in an era of divided government and polarized politics. Both sides have signaled their desire to avoid a shutdown, but remain unwilling to cede ground on core issues, turning the budget process into a test of political resolve. As Vance concluded his remarks, the sense of urgency was unmistakable. The vice president's warning that the country is headed to a shutdown served as both a prediction and a call for action. JD Vance said, "Let's do it in the context of an open government that's providing essential services to the American people." With less than 2 days left before funding expires, the focus shifts back to Capitol Hill, where negotiations will continue under intense public scrutiny. Whether leaders can bridge their differences before the deadline remains uncertain. For millions of Americans who rely on government services and federal paychecks, the stakes could not be higher. The next 36 hours will reveal whether political leaders can avert a crisis or plunge the nation into another damaging shutdown.